very much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for bringing those insights to the seminar and for contributing so much to the field. Thank you. So the next speaker is Laura Dormer. Laura Dormer is actually someone that I worked with for very many years as well. And I always tell her she's one of my favorite editorial leading lights in the field. So just a quick bio here. She's the founder of Becaris Publishing Limited. And she actually started her career around about the time the first GPP was published, which is interesting. So she's been able to contribute an enormous amount to the field, and has a number of insight from the editorial perspective. She's also the editor-in-chief of Learned Publishing, the official journal of the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers. So I'm going to hand the baton on to Laura. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you, Dikran. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So yes, so hi everybody, nice to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to take part. I'm going to talk a bit now about how GPP relates to editors and publishers. So first of all, why is it important to us? So as we now know from my colleagues on this presentation, GPP provides guidance for the publication of company-sponsored manuscripts, peer-reviewed manuscripts, and that includes issues such as ethics, transparency, all sorts of information about publication activities that occur before, during, and after submissions to us in the journal sphere. And also policies and procedures that industry have in place to support all these activities. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Sorry, no, previous one. Thank you very much. So as editors and publishers, it's important for us, first of all, to be aware of how GPP relates to our journal guidelines and also sort of other overarching industry guidance within the publishing field. It's important for us to be aware of what it covers and what it recommends, both for our own knowledge, but also, as in my third point there, so that we know how we can best support authors of these types of publications. So what I'm going to do over the next few slides is talk through these kind of three points, hopefully to help you going forward in your editorial roles. Next slide, please. Thank you. So thinking then about how GPP relates to other industry guidance. So in creating GPP, and as I think Dikran alluded to earlier, this was quite an involved process of how we went about developing this new iteration of the guidance. And one of the important things that we did as part of that was looking at the existing best practice from various bodies to identify the best practice and to base GPP around that when we were putting it together. And the aim of GPP was to collect this information and interpret those generally accepted principles. So we're not reinventing anything, we're taking where it exists, we're taking best practice and incorporating that in. And I've just included a few of the organizations that we looked at as part of the GPP development process there. So guidance from all sorts of organizations like the American Medical Writers Association, the Council of Science Editors, COPE, which stands for the Committee of Publication Ethics, obviously ISMPP, ICMJE, as has been spoken about previously, all sorts of organizations, guidance, really, really helpful that already exists, that we wanted to incorporate and build our guidelines around. I think it's also important to be aware that we highlight within GPP that, and as Lisa has mentioned as well, the policies an organisation, so be that the industry sponsor, medical communications agency, these don't supersede the journal or the scientific guidance. So if a journal has particular specific guidance in place, that would take precedence. So it's important for authors to be aware of the guidelines of the particular journal that they are submitting to make sure that everything's in line as far as that goes. Next slide, please. So moving on now to talk about what is actually covered within GPP. So as an overview, GPP provides, as mentioned already, recommendations for publishing company-sponsored medical research, including peer-reviewed manuscripts. It has guidance on ethics and transparency, as well as the planning and the development and the review and the approval of biomedical publications, and policies and procedures that describe this. It retains many of the principles that have been in the previous iterations of GPP, but it's also been updated, obviously, to reflect sort of relevant updates within the industry. So there's been updates in the intervening period to things like ICMJE recommendations, and also advances in just the field of publishing in general. So enhanced content, the use of plain language content, the really sort of expanded use of social media over the last few years in the publishing field. Next slide, please. So obviously there's not time to cover the entire GPP document, as Lisa said, there's an awful lot of words in there. But over the next few slides, I will highlight some of the key areas that I kind of pulled out from a journal editor's perspective that I think it's useful to be aware of. And for these and other areas of GP that aren't covered as well, it's important for us as editors to be aware of these and to think about how we can ensure that we are supporting industry authors. So they might come, quite often authors will come to the journal editor with queries about best practice, and it's important for us to be sort of fully informed so that we can help guide them where we can. It's also important to make sure that as journal editors, we're not making requests of our authors that conflict with recommendations that are contained within their own guidance, wherever that's feasible. And it's also helpful that the journal supports authors in meeting the recommendations wherever possible. So allowing things like, and helping to facilitate things like these author groups, study groups, investigator groups, and helping them to make sure that that's all done correctly. So in terms of authorship and contributorship side of things, as mentioned by Lisa, the ICMJE criteria are recommended by default, but as stated, that's unless the journal policy differs. So important for us to be very clear as editors what those policies are, have our policies nice and clearly available for people to be able to discover. The inclusion of a description of each author's and contributor's role is recommended in GPP. So it's helpful for journals to help facilitate that wherever possible. As also mentioned already, GPP is advocating for patient authors and patient advocates to be included as authors and contributors where that's appropriate. And again, it's useful for journals to help in that process and have a think about how any journal processes might be impacted if patient authors are included. Sometimes we have requests for authors that might be compulsory that might not be appropriate for a patient author. So things like listing affiliations and what's the most appropriate affiliation for an author and patient author, and all those kind of things are things to have a think about as a journal editor. Inclusion of contributor lists is recommended. So thinking about how that might be included within your journal as an editor, whether that's within the publication, whether that's as a supplementary file, that's interesting to think about. It's also worth bearing in mind that authorship can and might change during a revision process. So usually, sometimes peer review comments might recommend changes, and that can mean the addition of authors during that revision process. So having procedures in place to help facilitate that is useful from the journal perspective. Next slide, please. So moving on now to preprints. So that's another sort of area that's really kind of blossomed over the last few years since the last iteration of GPP. So due to a lack of peer review, GPP doesn't endorse the proactive use by authors of preprint servers for publication of company-sponsored clinical trial data. That's kind of the recommendation within GPP. However, we don't, there's no objection where this is standard practice by a reputable journal. GPP doesn't act as a barrier to that. So standard practice might include things like posting preprints or accepted versions of manuscripts after peer review prior to page proofs or final publication. That some journals have that as part of their standard practice, and GPP doesn't stand in the way of that. And that's again the sort of thing that an author might come and ask an editor about if they're not quite clear on the journal's policies and how that may or may not conflict with their own understanding of GPP. So it's useful for us to be aware of that side of things. Authors are asked to ensure that the correct versions are posted on preprint servers where that is the case, and also to make reasonable efforts to make sure that preprints are linked with the final publication in a timely manner, or in fact removed if that's possible. So again, it's useful if editors are able to act as a help towards that. Next slide, please. So something that I think was particularly welcome in this iteration of GPP was guidance on enhanced content, including plain language summaries, or PLS, as they're often called. It was something I think that was very sort of eagerly anticipated in the new version. So GPP does endorse the use of this enhanced content. Obviously, we appreciate how valuable it is to spreading the information within a publication. It should, of course, be developed following the same ethical and quality principles as the main publication. Included within enhanced content, we talk about the use of plain language summaries to support communication of scientific information to lay audiences, as was highlighted right at the beginning of Lisa's slides about how important this is to help improve inclusivity. Enhanced content can cover all sorts of things. The formats might be text, so it's kind of plain language text. It might be video content, it might be audio, it might be shared via a podcast. It might be a bit of a mixture of text and graphics, and some very nice infographics that are being created these days. And I think the most important thing really is that enhanced content must be consistent with that of the underlying publication, and it must not be promotional in language or tone or anything like that. So again, it's useful for us as editors to be aware of this guidance, as authors might inquire what options our particular journal might have in terms of enhanced content. Next slide, please. So another area around which there's been a lot of interest and people were looking forward to seeing in the new version of GPP was the recommendations around social media. And again, this is something that's really kind of expanded over the last few years. As we all know, journals often share publications via social media. That's obviously a great way of getting the information out to the audience, and can sometimes also make requests to authors about this. So we might ask for suggested wording for a tweet. We might ask authors to share the posts that the journal puts out, those sorts of things. So the recommendations within GPP are that postings about publications of company-sponsored data that can appear promotional, because obviously social media is something that's going out directly to the public, even if they are intended to be informational. So the recommendations within GPP are that posts shouldn't come from sponsor employees, company employees' personal accounts, but rather they should be limited to the company's own company-sponsored accounts, and they should follow any sort of internal procedures that that company might have around social media, all of which are in place to make sure that things are done ethically and non-promotionally. Any request that a journal might make should be managed by the corresponding author, is recommended in GPP, and where that corresponding author is a sponsor employee, they shouldn't make comments on draft posts, expect to correct any sort of factual errors. So once again, that's important for us as editors to be aware of when we're making those kind of requests to authors, what their kind of restrictions are and what the guidance is in terms of best practice for that to be done ethically. And next slide, please. Okay, so this is my final slide. So just having a sort of final think about how editors can support authors of these kind of publications. So as stated, I think it's really, really important for us to become familiar with these recommendations, how they relate to our sort of day-to-day activities on a journal. It's useful to have a think about where current journal policies might be conflicting with GPP, and if it's possible, and if it works within the journal's kind of own guidelines, to update those where possible, so that everything is nice and sort of smooth and seamless for authors. As well as sort of making sure that everything's in alignment, it's useful to just make sure that there is clarity in editorial policies. They're nice and easily available, easy for authors to look up, because in certain instances, GPP and other industry guidelines, they defer to the journal. So things like timing of the development of enhanced materials can vary between journals. Some journals want you to submit that up front with the original first draft, and others have them a bit later. So being aware of that. I think just generally, and by sort of being on this webinar, we're already doing that kind of endorsing and disseminating GPP, whether that's via our own guidance, answering any questions authors have for us, and using that sort of when we're training up new editorial staff as well, from a publisher's perspective. I think that's my final slide, so thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciated your insights. So we're going to have a section with questions, but just before we do that, I'd like to wrap up this section by thanking a bunch of people, actually. So thank you, Marianne, for talking through the ACSE, and also Fiona through ISMPP. So those major organizations are going to be absolutely crucial to making sure that uptake of GPP